Hello and welcome. This is video number 2 in a two-part series about totalitarianism. And we're taking a close look at Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union as a good example of the emergence of totalitarianism and a place where it played out. So in today's video, we're going to focus on some of the more specific aspects of how Joseph Stalin used totalitarianism strategies to try to create the Soviet Union that he desired. All right, so first off today, I just want to talk a little bit about totalitarian control and how that was used. All right, Stalin attempted to build a perfect communist state by getting rid of all his enemies. And part of what makes this a particularly strange stretch of time, fairly early in the time that Stalin was in power in the Soviet Union, was he was trying to get rid of all enemies, both real and perceived. There certainly were enemies that he had. It would stand to reason. But a lot of the people that came under scrutiny when he was in power were probably not enemies. They just were believed to be so. And so ways to determine who might be an enemy. One of the strategies that was used was to use kids. You know, we talked in the previous video about kids being impressionable and a focus for being brainwashed, for lack of a better way of putting it. But kids were encouraged to tell on their parents, for example, if they heard their parents saying something that might be negative about the state or negative about Stalin. They were encouraged to report on them, to turn them in. And basically, if someone was told on, if someone was reported as having said something negative about the state, for example, they were viewed as traitors and very often were executed. Best case scenario was probably being sent far away to serve in some kind of a labor camp. But many people ended up being killed simply because somebody said they said something that was negative. And that may or may not have been true. And even if they said something negative, that may or may not have meant a total lack of support for the government. But at any rate, that was one of the ways to try to keep people in line and to try to root out potential enemies. You get to 1934, for example, and you get into a stretch of time that ends up being called the Great Purge, where not just regular people throughout the Soviet society might be under scrutiny, but Stalin began to go after members of the Communist Party itself, the kinds of people who you might naturally expect to have been the most loyal kinds of people to a person like Stalin, or at least to the country and government of the Soviet Union. And in some cases, we're talking people that were very, very close to Stalin. You get to 1937, and that's when you really get to this Great Purge time, where basically he tried to get rid of anybody that he believed was an actual threat to his power. As I was saying before, people who were viewed this way sometimes were sent to labor camps. Often they were killed. One of the things that did come through this process was he did gain total control of the Soviet Union, as you might imagine, if nothing else, through fear. And as far as the estimated number of people who died during just this relatively short stretch of time, the estimates are between 8 and 13 million people were killed for this. So basically, people who were perceived or viewed for some reason or another as being an enemy, as being a traitor in some way or another, were put to death. And again, I want to emphasize that through the use of propaganda techniques and indoctrination, these people that went missing, these people that were sent off to prison, these people that were ultimately killed, people did not associate those things as happening, as being a part of Stalin himself. And then one thing I want you to take a look at, if you haven't seen this on the screen already, is an example of a technique that was used quite a bit, which was to alter, basically to change history, basically is what it comes down to. What you see there, the left-hand picture, the left-hand side of it is the before, the right-hand side of it is the after. You can see that in the right-hand side picture, it's just Stalin by himself. That was an example of somebody who was removed and killed, and then information that would indicate that person's existence was wiped clean to make it as if they never existed. So that was one of the practices that I find personally particularly disturbing, to not just, kill somebody who you perceived as an enemy, but then to try to make it as if they never existed. Pretty scary stuff. All right, another thing to speak to is the methods used or the attempts used to control the economy and make the economy of the Soviet Union work. In this case, in Stalin's totalitarian Soviet Union. And what he used, was what we could best describe as a command economy, which meant that the government, or more likely a very small group of people, made all the economic decisions for the Soviet Union. This would probably be an example of the most socialist type of economy that you could realistically have. And essentially what his goal was perfectly fine. His goal was to help the Soviet Union's economy boost its production and catch up to the productive abilities and capabilities of other world powers, and to do so quickly. Not necessarily a bad goal to have, but when you look at what was done to try to make that happen, you can see that there were some problems. As far as trying to boost industry or industrial capacity, they began a series of what they called 5-year plans. And basically what they were goals and targets for production in all types of ways over a 5-year period. So in essence, at the end of the 5-year period, you would achieve all of these goals. Now and again, probably nothing wrong with that either. It's probably good to set goals. The big problem though was the expectations for what they could accomplish were beyond realistic, and the consequences for people not meeting the goals very likely were going to be, or could be, fatal for them, or at least best case scenario, sent to a prison. And maybe to give you an example of the unrealistic nature of this, for example, I like to play golf, and I like to play golf well. If Stalin was to set up a plan for me to improve and become a better golfer, he would probably set up a plan that said, at the end of 1 year, I would consistently have a score of 55 for 18 holes. Theoretically, it's possible to have a score like that, but realistically, it's impossible. And that was the kind of expectations people had, or that was the kind of expectations that the people had to try to live up to. Now, one of the big problems that affected everybody, whether you were involved directly in production or not, is that in order to try to produce more industrial goods like steel and oil, consumer goods, think about things that you just have every day in your house, clothing, just everyday items. Production of those items was put on hold. And so one of the things that people had to live with in the Soviet Union was shortages of just a lot of the regular everyday items that people liked to have. And then as far as whether or not these plans actually worked, it's believed that gains were made through these processes, but it is still difficult to know exactly what those gains might have been, if at all, because it's hard to know how accurate the production numbers were. Because the fear of failure was so great, a lot of people put fake numbers or false numbers out to make it look like they were producing like they were supposed to, because the view basically was it'd be better to lie now and live a little bit longer than be truthful now and die now for sure. I might as well die later. Maybe I'll have a better chance. And so at any rate, it was tough to know exactly what all they were accomplishing. And regardless of anything else, the work people were expected to do was very difficult and very demanding. And it was definitely a hard life for people who were involved with that. The last thing I want to speak to is just some steps that were taken to try to improve agriculture. Because again, try to use these totalitarian methods to control what happened with agricultural production, just like with industrial production. And so what you see here were high expectations for producing with agriculture. And the way they were going to go, the way he decided to do it was to not allow private farms to operate as had been true for centuries, but rather to take over and seize all of that private farmland and combine it into what they called collective farms. And basically this amounted to seizing approximately 25 million individual farms worth of land and just combining them into really a giant collective farm. And then it would be on these collective farms that the families would be expected to work. And what they were producing was to go specifically to the state. They were not to take any food for themselves. They were not going to be allowed to sell any of what they produced for any kind of personal profit. It was all to go to the state. And some of the people that resisted this the most, at least early on, were called kulaks, or wealthy peasants, wealthy landowners. They were very resistant to having their land taken. And what you saw happen for those who resisted is they were killed. You basically got the message that you farmed where you were told to farm, and you gave up your land if you were told to give up your land, or you would be killed. So it's not hard to understand why people got in line with some of the expectations, because they basically had no choice: get on board or die, and that's what you can generally expect within a totalitarian regime. And then, one last thing, just want to point out this poster on this one that relates to agriculture: harvest all crops till the last grain, Stalin's. Because with this kind of disassociation with the negative things they experienced and Stalin, that could be motivating for people, because even in the worst of times, many people did not associate that the person behind it all was their leader, Stalin. And that's where we're going to leave things for today. This, of course, is just a very brief look at the concept of totalitarianism and a little bit how it played out in the Soviet Union under Stalin. But hopefully that is illustrative in what totalitarianism was and is. And thanks for watching.